Yeah, I just wanted to introduce everyone. Hello, everyone. And, I'm a visiting faculty here for this week, and I'm really honored to invite my former colleague, but he's still a colleague, I think. He's always working, even after he retired a few months ago. So he's Professor Emeritus, but he's been my colleague for over 30 years. He's formally from the Department of Management, but his research spans several disciplines, and he's published with almost everyone across different disciplines. A prolific researcher, has been a Fulbright scholar to China in the past, has taught in Calcutta, has visited TISC in Mumbai, and is currently a Fulbright specialist. So he doesn't stop working. I won't take too much of this morning's session because it's a relatively short session, but I do also want to say that I'm especially thankful for Professor Meising to do this at 10 p.m. at night on a Thursday at Albany. And so I think that's really remarkable. And special thanks to the Chancellor, to the Vice Chancellor, Dr. Bhatt, and Dr. Maiskar, the Pro-Vice Chancellor, the Dean, Dr. Prashant Mishra, and of course the Erasmus Harmony Program for their collaboration and for sponsoring this. Thank you. And over to Dr. Meising.
All right, well, thank you. Let me just, I guess, start by saying good morning, or here, in my case, it's good evening. But in spite of our distance, one thing we share is that we're all tired. So I hope to make this pretty stimulating, and to keep you here, I will give you the PDF version of my presentation in the chat room when I'm done, because I don't want you to flip too far ahead and just bail out on me. This whole topic has been an interest of mine since my doctoral program, and I've been fortunate to just continue doing things in this area throughout my career, and I'm still doing things in this area. And a few years ago, I was teaching a course on sustainability. I stumbled across ESG, and I thought I found the Holy Grail. And I became a missionary for ESG. But now I'm not quite so sure it's a Holy Grail anymore. So I'll try to explain some of that background stuff to you. And if you're interested, I invite you to collaborate anyway. Okay, so title. The title is really ESG, try to highlight an emerging scholarly grand challenge, but I'm going to cover all that stuff in a short time, hopefully. And you see in my name, same highlight. I wasn't aware that my family name has ESG as part of the DNA. So this whole ESG thing is really, part and parcel of me, my personality, my character. So let me begin with the quiz. These agree, disagree. No answer. I'm just going to give you the questions and you can think about it and we'll come to it later. Primary responsibility of corporations to shareholders. Yes. I should have had this as a poll, I suppose, but what about managers in the company should make and keep as much profits as they can?
Well,
yeah, you can give your, use the icons to give the thumbs up or thumbs down. Might be easier.
You have the hands you can use. Managers and their companies should be evaluated on the quarter results. There's a trade-off between social impact and financial performance. So these are some of the themes I'm going to hit on. And I see we already started being a little provocative, I guess. Okay, so let's have a conversation about some of these issues. How's that? Since the title has this word, Grand Challenge, I'm going to speak a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about what are these responsibilities. Get into what are these three magic letters. And then hopefully I can get through the argument for doing it, basically competitive advantage, three aspects, financial results, hopefully, then operations, nitty gritty, and then strategy, top level. I'll try to go through all of that. And then I'll leave you with some opportunities to actually conduct research, because there are criticisms about metrics as well as ESG. Leave you with an agenda to sustain the momentum. Wow, how's that? Think we cover enough there? Then wrap it up. Okay, and then maybe Q&A. I want to start with the grand challenge with the NASA moonshot as an example, because I want to equate what we're talking about, ESG, as being a moonshot. So that's sort of my perspective on it. So the Apollo program was very expensive, but it succeeded because of these C's: collaboration, coordination, cooperation, collection, careful contracting. There's a parallel, I think, to ESG. On the bottom, full disclosure, I did work at NASA prior to the moon, but I did work on a space shuttle. So the result were these many commercial spinoffs, which we take for granted. We all have our electronic toys and we take advantage of all these things, and we don't really think about it, but that space race led to a lot of advances. All I'm trying to get at here is parallel ESG. Kicking and screaming, we don't want to do it anyway. Yeah, there might be require a big effort, a lot of resources, but in the end, we could all benefit from the outcome. And so all these spinoffs, very successful economically. Now, question here, the big question is, can business and society create this shared value like NASA, contractors, citizens, and so on? And at the end, where do we come in as academics? What is our role, responsibility, job? What can we do? How can we further this agenda? JFK, who got this whole moonshot going, said, we choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. ESG may not be easy. We do it because it's hard, because that challenge, we're going to win, and that challenge will lead to benefits for all. So on the bottom, the U.S. moonshot, whoops, I meant to do something else. Okay. The U.S. moonshot for the 60s race refers to anything that's this grand challenge, extremely ambiguous project or mission to achieve a monumental goal. I think ESG is part and parcel of that. So what is a business moonshot? Up in the corner, up here are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, a moonshot. A lot of companies don't really want to do it, but we're trying to get them to do it. Question here is, can ESG help achieve social impact, such as sustainable development, and remain profitable? Can they do both? So if doing both, or if solving these problems is an ideal, which businesses cannot meet, then there's a trade-off. So social impact competes with financial performance. That's one point of view, right? Pick your poison, which you prefer. But yet some companies are being ambidextrous. They're multitasking. They're doing both. And so the other perspective is, if you have the right government policies and cooperation with all stakeholders, then they support each other. They're complementary, in which case social impact might lead to financial performance, or even the other way around. Maybe financial performance can lead to social impact. So here, they support each other, and it could be social impact supports financial, or the other way around, but there's some complementariness there, perhaps. I want to contrast three isms that are somewhat confusing and focus on one of them. So to give you my background, my perspective, first, capitalism. Capitalism is not just about money. The word originates from kaput, the head, and it really has to do with, capital has to do with ideas. So to me, capitalism is all about innovation. But we really value the market because we get progress by having these incentives, creating, innovation, and so on. And so you don't have to be in a democracy. You don't have to be in other kinds of systems to still have innovation and ideas. Corporatism is different to me. Here, corporate charters, I consider to be extensions of the state. There's a long history of corporate chartering, but basically they were the first ones, the East Indies companies first, the Dutch, then the British, were doing things that the government wanted to do, explore, go around the world, get those spices, but couldn't afford to do, use incentives, so create these entities that had shareholders. In the US, the first corporations were public works projects, same rationale. But I have a lot of issues with what is a shareholder? There is some responsibility, some obligation in providing information to shareholders so they can make good decisions. But what is a shareholder? I have a few examples. A day trader, if someone owns a share, few shares for 30 seconds, should they influence what the company does? Futures investor, you buy an index or you buy some future hog bellies in Chicago or whatever, can you really influence what that company does? What about index funds? Here you have a whole portfolio, a variety of stocks. Can you really influence the companies in that portfolio? So I really wonder, are these shareholders investors? Are they owners or merely speculators? What is it that you really own? And the last ism is globalism. And so the initial charters were used to go conquer other parts of the world. But these countries have different rules, different resources, but they all compete for trade. And so corporate charters were used in the era of mercantilism to incentivize investors. But now we have companies, corporations that are more powerful and larger than even the countries. So we've kind of gone way, I think, overboard in giving all this power to these companies that are really hard to control. So how do we nudge them over into ESG? So that's, I think, the predicament that we face. I think we're familiar with shareholder capitalism. So in this pyramid, for compliance, legal and economic companies do what they have to do, kicking and screaming, further up commitment. So shareholder capitalism, economic and legal compliance. So the executives are employees of the owners, that is the shareholders. And if they get involved in all these social causes, it reduces financial performance because they're now spending money of all these other stakeholders and deciding on how these resources are allocated. If they attempt to achieve these social goals, then they're going to lose focus on what they're really hired to do, which is maximize shareholder value. Moreover, if they're concerned with the community rather than profits, then they become tyrannical. No one voted for them. They're not mayors or governors, and yet they can influence what happens in the community. So those are the reasons for not to get too far away from maximizing profits. In 1997, the Business Roundtable came up with the statement, shareholder primacy view, which I think we're all familiar with. The job of the board and management is to maximize shareholder wealth. The only thing that matters is shareholders. Also now known as the Friedman Doctrine, there's one and only one social responsibility of business, increase profits to the shareholders. So there are a lot of critics who disagree, and I'll be one of them. Contrast that with stakeholder capitalism that says that some companies have an ethical and philanthropic commitment to do the right thing. So multiple stakeholders. In my view, sorry, Rita, but the finance industry is self-serving. They come up with all these rationales to maximize profits, and yet they tend to be the primary beneficiary of maximizing profits. I worked on Wall Street for 3 weeks till I learned it was not my culture. I was asked to do things, it was not my culture. So it's it's a very individualistic dog eat dog, environment, and they justify all this stuff and they benefit from maximizing profits for them. Obsession, quarterly results, and all that, trying to look good and not be good, and to me, it hurts everyone in the long run. So in this other view, managers are stewards. Professional managers are responsible for public, the trustees for all stakeholders. So on the right, we have multiple stakeholders. I see them as magnets. They pull and push and pull and push. And so one of the problems of being a manager is you have to try to balance all of these demands, many of which conflict. Not an easy decision, but that's why you get paid the big bucks. For these stakeholders is reciprocity. In other words, they benefit, but businesses also require something from them. They have a stake. Yeah. I'm sorry, what? Rajesh?
No, carry on. I think she had her microphone on by mistake. No worries.
All right. So reciprocity, so stakeholder is whoever has a stake in what's affected, but they're also influential. And so businesses require something from stakeholders. So there's reciprocity. So managers don't have a dilemma, they have a multi-lemma. They have to balance all of these different stakeholders. A lot of diversity, and that really complicates the job of a manager trying to figure out who do you satisfy. And ESG is similar because you can't do all three usually. So there's always this balancing act. I think this part we're all pretty clear about. I think it's pretty standard, we're familiar with in finance, but also management economics. I too hate being a greedy bastard, but we have a responsibility to our shareholders, right? It's not me, it's the system. But to whom are these companies really responsible to? And again, I draw a line of corporations, a charter. If so, how can they become more responsible to stakeholders? ESG might be able to slip in here, especially with some of the mandates requiring transparency. But I can also call this woke capitalism, woke being a very pejorative term in the US. So here we have capitalism, free market system that's guided by self-interest and profit. Okay, so capitalism, I said, is about ideas. Fair enough, but it can breed greed, excess, abuses. Bad enough. Corporatism are these chartered firms that have all of this power, expertise, clout. They can impact society. And so do they have an obligation in exchange? As I mentioned before, as extensions of a state, corporation, a chartered corporation, has noble obligation, noblesse oblige, to make these investments that are socially responsible, or SRI, or also called social impact investment. So I'm trying to make these contrasts. There are a couple of arguments for doing that, one of which is it's in their own self-interest. If you are responsible, then you're going to avoid a lot of problems, and you'll get all this great reputation and so on. And so the complementariness, again, between self-interest and social responsible investing, or SII as well, can be considered to be a means to an end. You may not really like to be responsible, but that might be more successful financially to you. So that's the woke capitalist argument. With that, the Business Roundtable flipped on its view. And so they came up with the stakeholder primacy view to challenge the shareholder primacy view. Basically, what I try to show before. So here we have the Business Roundtable a couple of decades earlier, and then more recently coming up with this view that you really need to satisfy all stakeholders. So that's pretty much my background. I don't know if you're familiar with Nietzsche's famous statement, though, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So back to the moonshot. We don't do it because it's easy. We do it because it's hard. It doesn't kill you, make you stronger. And so One of the arguments for ESG is resilience. You may not want to do it, you may not like to do it, but by rising to that challenge, it will make companies better and then financially successful. So that's sort of my perspective on this topic. So what is ESG besides knowing what the three letters stand for? ESG up here in the upper right, before it was triple bottom line, it had other acronyms and that sort of thing. This is on the left is the Google searches for ESG. Looks like a couple of years ago, 2020, it really went through the roof. Took a little drop, I guess COVID, whatever. But these are Google searches. What is ESG? And if you Google now ESG and any other word you want, you're going to get a lot of stuff. Problem is, they're all different and they don't agree and they conflict with each other. So we still have a lot of overwhelming amount of information that we can't make sense of. Environmental, this is from Schroders. Examples, I think we're all familiar with this stuff, environmental. And then on the bottom, some of the companies that Schroders says do it. Social, I think we're familiar with some of this. Let me just point out that most ESG commentaries, studies, discussions focus on the E. The E seems to dominate the others. Social is becoming a little more, I think, important with DEI, but the focus tends to be more on HR. I think the other stakeholders, except for the community, can fall under the social. And so here are some examples according to Schroders. The community can fall on, I think, under governance. And here are some examples as well. And the reason for the community, we all know governance is who decides on what these companies do, but it also, deals with what goes on in the community overall and the relationship between the company and that community. So anyway, all of these different types of activities fall into one of these three buckets. Okay. I want to invest in something that respects the environment, it's morally responsible, socially active, aids the poor and the homeless, and makes me a bundle. That's the predicament, right? I mean, if you could achieve all of those simultaneously, we wouldn't be here. It would be a no-brainer, right? So, are there trade-offs? How much are you willing to give up? How much of an ROI hit are you willing to take to do this? Or do they reinforce each other? Now, that would be the ideal, right? But if so, which direction? Do you need to be profitable to be responsible? Or by being responsible, are you profitable? I don't know. Let's have this conversation. So, on the E, this is data, world's most sustainable companies. I picked the top 5 that were publicly listed, or a few others snuck in, like Patagonia. No data, so these are the top 5 publicly listed currently from this one source, Magazine Sustainability. There's a black line in there, that's the S&P 500, and the black line kind of cuts through the middle. It would be great if the black line was down here, the S&P, and all the good guys were up here. We wouldn't have this conversation, right? But the black line, you got winners and losers, and then you get the S&P right down the middle. Above average, below average, and a lot of change in time. Now, I got to tell Rita this, I'm not a big fan of market efficiency theory. I don't believe the stock market knows what's going to happen. I don't think it reflects the present value, future streams, all this other stuff, full knowledge. But it does give us some change over time compared to peers, and that's all I'm interested in. So these pictures, I think, are kind of cute. They say something. Those are the companies. But the case is not overwhelming. And so questions. Are the good guys because of the efforts, or are there negative results because they spend too much? I don't know. Different sectors. Can we look at different sectors and say, well, it looks like Ørsted, they're in that business. You got a bank. Well, they're not really in that business. So I don't know. And then this is global. Can we separate out US companies and see how they do? I don't know. And the The problem I had with the global companies was they were all over the place. The S for global company data was just a mess. So I just went with year-old data, USA, and it's kind of similar. Actually, the black line here is on the uptrend, and a couple of companies are above, a couple of below, and the yellow is kind of in line. But what I found interesting is the three tech companies, Qualcomm, HP, Cisco, seem to track a little bit better. But again, not an overwhelming case. CSR efforts, I don't know. High tech, others, you got food and you got appliance. I don't really know. And then is it US companies versus global companies? I don't really know. But anyway, I just found it interesting that the ones that were a little bit better were the tech companies, at least of the 5 that I picked out here, the top 5 that were listed. Now, governance is a little trickier. The data isn't quite the same. I think we all understand governance. So I said before, ESG really is overwhelmed by the E. The S is starting to come more into play. G is not really talked about very much. To me, ESG should be GSE. It should begin with governance, because if it's not done by the board, it ain't going to get done, right? And so strategy begins at the top, and then they decide. I just find that pretty peculiar that ESG discussion is on one end of the spectrum, eliminates the other. So again, I think we're pretty familiar. What is governance? The board of directors does all this stuff. But also they engage in public policy, political spending, that kind of community environment engagement. Agency theory. So separation, owners from managers. So the shareholders don't really control other than through proxy voting, going to board meetings, that sort of thing. So the shareholders are the principals. They elect the board. The board is legally accountable to them. So this is where ESG is starting to change things a little bit. The board then hires professional managers, the agents, but the agents have a lot of discretion in what they do. The business judgment rule, they can do most anything to line their own pockets and say, well, it's business judgment, because in the long run, you'll be better off. But they're not around usually for the long run. And so because of the separation, it makes it difficult for shareholders to really monitor what's going on. And then, yeah, I know we have annual reports, and most of them today include a section on ESG, a lot of which is really greenwashing anyway. So to be able to really monitor is a lot of effort. They pass the buck, can't really worry. And so I'm not sure that shareholders even want to get involved in managing the company. I think they're speculators. When I go to the racetrack, put down $2, I don't own a piece of the horse, right? I have some right to get a piece of the winnings. I don't own the horse. So there's a big disconnect there as well. So shareholders appoint these members to make these decisions. Now, there's also this resource dependence theory, which basically says that board members, do a lot of things as well that they have these resources, that they have these networks and other kinds of things and connections. They don't really, provide a lot of oversight, but they have another role to play. And then institutional theory, corporations are people. They're institutions, same as we are. In the U.S. Supreme Court case, Citizens United made this statement. And so stakeholders might be able to limit what they do and shape some of this, some of the action that they take. So these are some of the different perspectives on who actually runs these large corporations. Here's a gadflight at the board meeting. And here this, I guess, chairman, CEO said, this is the part of capitalism I hate. Having some shareholder actually get involved. Be passive, not active. So nice theory. The reality is that these self-interested boards and managers might conflict with shareholders. Here's a list of examples. They spend shareholder money. for other things. Friedman didn't complain about this. He complained about spending money for good things, social issues. These he didn't really complain about. So we have the active versus passive. The gadflies can buy a couple of shares of a company, go to a meeting, and try to collect proxy votes and have some influence. But my question still remains, do shareholders have rights beyond speculating on the future value of their investment? How much influence should they have? Are they really that knowledgeable? Adam Smith famously wrote, being the managers rather of other people's money than their own, it cannot well be expected that they should watch over it with the same anxious vigilance. In other words, self-interested board, self-interested manager. So here we have conflicts between the principal and the agent, the shareholder, and those who are supposed to look at for their interests because of the separation. So governance is a huge issue. How do we get to influence? So the bad news might be, well, they're going to take shareholder money for themselves. The good news is if they don't have to respond only to shareholders, that opens up stakeholders. If they're going to have that discretion, stakeholders can enter. So my argument centers around competitive advantage. I'm a strategy guy as well, as I like to think I'm socially active and responsible. The question here is, why would ESG kind of be close to corporate financial performance? I think that's really the big issue. The UN came out with this a number of years back, arguing for CSR, and basically, I'll show you the picture. It looks something like this. At the base, the 3 E's, economic, environmental, equity, which could be triple bottom line or ESG, starts with the strategy. So how do you integrate ESG into the business model? When you do that, that contributes to the operations. Operations, to me, I want to focus on best practices, opportunities, and efficiencies. Then we get to financial results, superior earnings and share price. So ESG can be seen in this way, where you start at the bottom, try to achieve it, strategy to get it done through operations, get the result in financial returns. So that's how I see this whole issue. If you don't show the money, then it's a tough battle. But if the money is there, it's that obvious, we wouldn't have a battle anyway. So this is where you kind of try to figure out which way to wend it. Start at the top. So most of the studies actually did find a positive, stable relationships. These more than 2,000 studies. This is a little hard to figure out, but basically all these correlations are between performance, right, and financial results over time. And so this line shows that most of the studies show a pretty high and a stable performance. Some were negative, but the conclusion was the vast majority of studies showed this positive result. That doesn't mean causality, but there was some relationship there. And then they go on to show, compare non-portfolios to portfolios in different countries, regions. The non-portfolios were not non-ESG, which I found kind of interesting. So here in North America, there were more positive, these positive relationships. Those who did not focus on ESG actually did better across the board, different countries. And here, these are the emerging markets. What surprised me was that the emerging markets, which you'd expect, can't afford to, are doing more. There's more of a correlation. I can't explain all this. You can read the paper, we can chat about it, do more work, but the results seem to be pretty favorable to our cause. So another Smith quote, which shows a coincidence. The rich maybe have an invisible hand. Without intending it, without knowing it, they advance the interests of society. Maybe that there is that coincidence. They complement each other. The objective might not be to do good, but for one reason or another, they seem to go hand in hand. So for the investors, show me the money. Investors pick stocks they think will outperform the market. financial firms are under increasing pressure to exclude the sinners from their portfolio. So we have the sinner examples here. Sinners here, these are the sin stocks. There's a transitioning to the saints, and this is ESG, from sinners to saints. And here you can see the pension funds, equity firms, hedge funds, $35 trillion back in 2022 for these firms that are trying to do the right thing. But a lot of the money actually goes to, I guess, the consulting side, indexes, instruments, research teams. The critics say the only ones who make money from this are those who offer advice or offer metrics. The companies not necessarily get the money. And there's so growing skepticism how well ESG really lives up to the claim. Is it greenwashing? But shareholders really want to know materiality, being able to make an informed decision is important for shareholders. And so stock exchanges are mandating transparency. Here are some examples. And like NASDAQ offers a lot of help, a lot of advice for companies who want to do it and trying to get into it. And so there are all these, different metrics available. Many of them are on these exchanges, required on these exchanges. So there are vehicles out there to do it, and there's a mandate to do it. So what I want to ask is, Gladwell came up with, the notion a tipping point. Is ESG a tipping point? A magic moment when an idea, trend, social behavior crosses a threshold, tips, spreads like wildfire. With the mandate on these exchanges, have we now reached a tipping point? Will companies take it seriously or just fill out forms, checklists, abide by the rules, but not really, do more? Will they look good, not be good? So here's some more data for you. I looked at the MSCI, which is pretty prominent, 400, which is the green, the orange. I'm sorry, the blue rather. The MSCI is the blue all over the place. The orange is the Dow Jones, pretty up. Green S&P 500, pretty stable but up. It looks like the good guys are all over the place. There doesn't seem to be any consistency. If the good guys were way above, or at least pretty stable, it will look favorable. So we get very mixed messages from looking at the data. Here I am giving a lecture on climate change. Threatens our existence and everyone's sleeping, right? Let me try something else. Race the board. Threatens our economy. Got your attention. Show me the money. That's what gets people's attention. So again, it'd be nice if it coincided. Can a business do well by doing good? If so, is it because ESG provides opportunities? If not, what about mitigating risk? Climate change being a big one. Hurricane Ian last year caused $100 billion of damage in the US, $100 billion. And so companies now want to protect shareholders from all of these other possible risks or avoid costs. GE is a poster child for excess PCB dumping in the Hudson River. They paid a huge settlement as well to clean up the Hudson. So these are some arguments for trying to, make the case for ESG. Back to Schroders, I showed you some data before. According to Schroders, the average price to book multiples was greater for the good guys than the bad guys. And some would say, well, price to book is because of intangibles, be it reputation, be it core competence, whatever, but outperforming. Low risk propensity, lower risk here. The good guys have lower risk than the bad guys. For some of the reasons I mentioned, And some critics say, well, it's really all about risk anyway. It's not about profits. Investor confidence. The capitalization for the good guys is higher than the bad guys. But the problem is no two matrices agree. So while we have some broad indication that maybe this is a good thing, the metrics remain problematic. All right, on to operations, best practices, opportunities, efficiencies. There's a greater imperative for companies to earn their social alliance and legitimacy by carefully applying these well thought out ESG initiatives. ESG can be seen as a core competence that provides sustainable competitive advantage others don't have. That's a strategy argument. But certain requirements, certain results. Identify or create global best practices for ESG. Manage the risks and opportunities while reducing exposure for any new initiatives. Achieving positive social impact. Collaboration with others. It's too heavy a lift to do on your own. Back to the NASA moonshot. And leveraging your supply chain to create shared value for everyone, all your stakeholders. Be transparent, engage everyone, involve them, and then share the wealth, creating shared value. Share the wealth internally, externally. Report, communicate what you're doing. So here I boil down the arguments into defense and offense. Defense, lower cost, lower threat, lower risk. For instance, financial capital, cheaper capital. Risk mitigation, already mentioned that. Avoid intervention, no government, less government. Labor, loyalty, lower the cost of that. So lower the cost. On the offense, enhance revenue and opportunities. For instance, reputational capital, reputation, image, core competence. Differentiate from the competition. HR here, more productive, more less turnover, that kind of thing. And innovation. And innovation is really an important piece here. I mentioned capitalism is about, innovation. And so to achieve a heavy lift, you have to do things differently. It's hard to just gloss over what you're doing and then set up some metrics or some departments or having individuals responsible. You need to do things a little bit differently. And that's a good thing because you come up with new products, new markets, that sort of thing. So on the bottom here, integration. How do you make ESG part of the business model? It won't be successful until it really becomes integrated into strategy. Here's some results in this latest survey, Infosys, thank you, Rita. Over 40% of companies focus their ESG efforts on the HR side, rather than structure, leadership, and culture, which really provide the greatest benefit. Putting authority and responsibility in the top is good for the bottom. For instance, 30% put responsibility in the C-suite, but only 2% make it part of their compensation. The strongest impact on profits and revenue was having Chief Sustainability Officer, Chief Diversity Officer, and an ESG board committee. Again, integration is really pretty critical. And yet companies that do not do it now are unlikely to do them later. In other words, maybe we've hit the ceiling of the companies that are even interested and engaged. So here's my approach. And I'm playing around with this. I haven't gotten too far. On the bottom is a note. This model is based on the program logic model that was developed for social enterprises. And basically, input, output, outcome, overall impact. I worked my way backwards. And so for the E, for the S, and the G, these are a half a dozen of the arguments for ESG, but you can't do everything. And so begin with, what do you really want to get done? Internally, externally, can you leverage? Can you get synergies? For the E, for the S, and the G. This approach to me, by working backwards, not only challenges you to rise to the occasion, it also focuses you to really understand what the crux of the matter is and develops coherence. So the next step is, I think I can come up with this matrix to determine priorities. Looking at how difficult each of these might be, looking at how feasible they might be, perhaps we can map these initiatives so that we can figure out who can work together. So then the synergies, it might be that multiple individuals or departments have the same purpose in mind. Perhaps they can share the resources for some activity. So anyway, this is one approach that I'm trying to look at to help integrate ESG into the business model. We're hiring a director of change management to help employees embrace strategic changes. Or we could come up with strategies that make sense, then employees would embrace change. And so my argument here is do the right thing. Employees, if you build it, they will come. Sounds harder, yeah, but leadership and culture are harder, soft side, and yet they're pretty critical to getting this done. So the time left, I'm going to talk a little bit about metrics, wrap up some of the problems and give you an agenda, perhaps. There's a lot of data, no consensus. Every data source has its own purpose, it's proprietary, different ways they do things. Investment funds that buy the data and use the data have their own objectives as well, and they calculate present value, differently. So the imputed cost of capital and time horizon is pretty important in how they do it. Some of the data that's necessary for this is easy, others are hard. Supply chain is a real bear. How do you audit your supplier? And how do you really see what your customer does with the waste product? So supply chain is a real problem. Also, companies are in different sectors, different environments, but yet the ESG indices don't include all these sectors. They really pretty selective. And there are statistical anomalies. Sometimes you get large companies that are overweight, or if there's a small company and they grow proportionally, the growth rate is going to be larger than you would like to see. I mean, just statistically is an anomaly because it's on a small base. So anyway, there are some metric issues here. Another survey, 81% of companies have a formal ESG program, only half believe it's really doing anything. And so a lot of motion with that effect. Another criticism is ESG aren't equal. Here's a guy juggling. So this is looking at Newsweek last year. Total score ranked from 1 to 100. Good guys, high down to low, pretty straight line, pretty easy to understand that. But these are the three different ones, E and S and G. Again, no pattern. They're all over the place. So I have no idea how they calculate a total. Do they add up the three? Do they weigh one more than the other? Is it the best one? What if you're good on one, not the other? I don't know. Anyway, a lot of confusion. Then you can go to Finance Yahoo, and they have sustainable analytics, looking mostly at the risk. So the risk is a big aspect of ESG. For instance, HP, green, they score low on risk, 508 out of a 14,000, so low on risk. And yet the E is where they score low. The G, they're kind of in the middle. Starbucks, next, but in the middle. So 6,300, 508 up to 6,300, riskier. They get bumped into the middle, but their worst is here. The S, they're really bad on the S, really good on the G. E, nothing. Move down to Tesla. They score pretty high because they make EVs, which are pretty popular. So they were the good guys. And yet, really low on the S, not too good on the G either. And then they come out in the middle. Exxon, unfortunately, is in the wrong business. They're always going to be on the high end of the risk side. If you're in this particular business, it's tough. So they come out at 12,000. We go from 508 to 12,000, very risky. Their best here at G, because they were forced to change board of directors, they were forced to, is in the median. E is always going to be really risky. So metrics, juggling, ESG. Another example of juggling, US, diverse geography, laws, culture, infrastructure needs, and so on. Imagine going global. I don't even want to compare US to India, but imagine going all over the place. There's this venture capital company, LVC, Longview Capital. They're in multiple states. So you go down here, the so-called red states, a lot of water, don't care about water problems. They don't recycle. They don't care about any of that stuff. They have their Environmental Protection Agency has never gone into a plant to see if they can improve things. Go out here. There's no water. You want to talk about recycling? We don't care. We don't have any water. Come up here, Northeast, very liberal. New York, a lot of water, a lot of regs. So these are all the investments they're making, and they're all in different places. So if you're running all these companies, how do you juggle across states? How do you prioritize the E and the S and the G when the different states have different requirements, different mandates, and then go global, make it even more complicated? The other thing is here are 7 of my grandkids, one more on the way. Rita, what's your present value? So how do you factor this into it? I had this conversation with someone who works for Train, very sustainable company, and I have solar panels. He was trying to make the case for him getting it, and he asked me to make the case, for him. The numbers never worked for him. I got so frustrated. I said, okay, here are my grandkids. Where do they fit in the equation? So this is another problem, getting to the intangibles and getting to the externalities. Another cynic besides me, Oscar Wilde once wrote, a cynic knows the price of everything, the value of nothing. So economics, finance, we do the pricing, not the value. What's really important? What do you value? I call this bad math, ignoring the externalities. A Big Mac doesn't cost that. It costs you your health. Netflix costs you your time. Social media, your focus. So E, what's the true cost of gasoline? We complain about it, but $4 or $5 a gallon is cheap. You can't get that engine. You can't get that same bang for the buck any other way. Empty can and nickel, is that what it's worth? No, it's worth a lot more because recycling that can, the big cost is in energy. And these other, a toaster oven, it costs a few bucks, throw it away and get a new one, just get it on Amazon. Well, the problem is no one is charging you for throwing in the dump. I mean, that's the real cost and so on. Light bulbs, a lot of examples. So true cost is not factored in. Employee and the S, what's the true cost of employee recruiting, turnover, DEI? Now we have what's called quiet quitting, right? They just are disengaged. And not even when they're on Zoom, they're just, even on the site, could be disengaged. And G, for the board, top managers, what's the true cost of not providing all information to stakeholders or involving the community? So these are the externalities, or these costs, I call it bad math, not factored into the total. More confusion, even if the numbers were right. We confuse correlation and causality. Which comes first? Some of the stuff I mentioned earlier. Generalizability, even if you find it one place, is it valid in different countries, different industries, different times, and so on? A lot of the data is based, and the studies are based on averages, but from the strategy point of view, no company wants to be average. Strategy is you want to be the outlier on the upside. And so statistically, we look at averages. So what? I don't want to be mediocre. Even if best practices are ascertained, it's hard to imitate. Again, companies aren't going to give away their good stuff. And sometimes it's just hard to identify, part of history. And you just can't replicate all that stuff. So even if you do find out how ESG contributes to success, why would they tell you? And then how do you evaluate social impact? Greatest good for the greatest number? Same confusion, do you pick one over the other? And on the other end, do businesses go far enough? Do we have to regulate them? So these are some of the issues. Are companies with all of these new regs and mandates, are they just checking off lists? Are they giving that list to one of their workers and saying, hey, tell me how much we spend for this and how good we do that, and just put everything together for the annual report? Are they looking good and not being good? Warren Buffett once made the statement that price is what you pay, value is what you get. And I'd say the same with some of the ESG benefits. What's valuable? What do you really value? And the math doesn't always make the case. So in this cartoon, all of the good stuff, the whole list, here I am again, making the argument. And here's the cynic. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? In philosophy, there's Pascal's argument that if you had a bet, does God exist or not? You should always bet that God exists. There's a lot of upside, little downside. If you go the other way and you bet God does not exist, if you're wrong, so what? But anyway, it's always better to do the ESG. You're going to create all these benefits for the company, even if it doesn't lead to that holy grail. So wrap things up, sustaining the momentum, research agenda. Black swan is that once in a while, low probability, but high impact. ESG, same thing. I'm suggesting that ESG will help you be resilient when the black swan does appear. Integrating ESG will help businesses become more resilient, avoid risks, seize opportunities when you have these grand challenges. That is, unlikely, disruptive, social, political, economic, other shocks with tremendous consequences. For instance, here's my list. Changing physical environmental conditions. How do you respond to that? No water, no whatever, right? Resources. COVID, enough said about that. Russia and Ukraine. A lot of pressure on food, petroleum, stagflation in this country. A lot of tech companies are laying off workers like crazy. Real estate bubbles, crashes, and our southern border, flood of migrants, shock to the system. Politics, Supreme Court, unpredictable now. Precedent, what happened before doesn't matter. And then being woke. All of a sudden, stuff you ignored becomes really, really important. So, to me, these are the key drivers for a company to be ambidextrous, being able to multitask, collaborate with stakeholders, therefore, in that way, creating shared value. What's interesting about this quote is he wrote this back in the 60s. It seems that times are still changing. They're always changing. The only constant is change. Last quiz. Will the great things you make the world great too? Are you planning to make big factories and bigger forests to support that? How much profit will the planet make from your actions? Would you look after farmers like you look after their crops? Is helping the less fortunate a part of your business plans? Do you agree that a woman is often the best man for the job? When you wake up in the morning, is it to make the whole world rise?